4. Secret Messiah. He would not be a humble carpenter or meek shepherd, preaching love and forgiveness in parables. Nor would he be a divinely incarnated offering to atone for the sins of man. The last Messiah, often Messiahs, of Israel would be a triumphant warrior figure, a righteous judge, high priest, and wise ruler. In the literature of Qumran, the messianic figures appear in various guises and with varying descriptions, but the circumstances under which they appear seem clear. At the end of an age of wickedness characterized by the enslavement of the people of Israel to idolatrous foreign powers, itself a punishment for the Israelites' own faithlessness to the laws of the covenant, divinely anointed leaders would rise to lead the righteous remnant to defeat their oppressors and preside over the establishment of a perfectly harmonious and egalitarian kingdom of heaven on earth. There was nothing metaphorical or otherworldly about this brand of messianic fervor. The people of Qumran shared the common belief of the time that the forces of darkness were represented on earth by none other than the Romans and their Judean agents, and that the elimination of wickedness would be brought about by an almost unimaginably bloody holy war. Then would come a period of renewal, in which the meticulous observance of the divinely appointed festivals, temple sacrifices, and purity codes would make the land exceedingly fertile, and as a result, peace and harmony would prevail. This was the futurist vision of a people who know only disorder, injustice, and the struggle to subsist in a poor country, where the rains were too often insufficient and where crops often failed. But what distinguished this messianic belief from a mere daydream was its balance of political and spiritual aspirations. The destruction of external oppression was only the first step towards spiritual redemption, which would only be achieved with the perfect fulfillment of the Mosaic Law. In this apocalyptic drama, the people of Israel would play a direct role in their own redemption. Led by their long-awaited Messiah and guided by a vision of righteousness, they would remake the world. Messianic references run through the literature of Qumran and its people, yet their precise meaning is not always clear. Written on torn and deteriorated parchment of colors varying from bleached white to burnt umber by many scribes, whose skill varied widely, these references appear in a number of literary genres and individual documents, some of which are extremely fragmentary. In some of the most important texts, the pitch darkness of the leather, the wrinkling or the shrinking of the torn edges, or the cramped, hurried handwriting make it difficult to recognize unambiguously more than a word or two on every line. That is why studying the scrolls can be an intensely subjective experience, in which a scholar's hopes, fears, beliefs, and preconceptions might determine what he or she sees. In that sense, the Dead Sea Scrolls can be a spiritual Rorschach test as much as an exercise in epigraphic or historical research. The faithful Christian, the secular humanist, the cynic, and the iconoclast all see something very different in the wrinkled brown leaves of ancient leather, with the Hebrew word Moshiach, Messiah, written all over them. What that word Mashiach means is, of course, a problem given its origins in ancient Israelite religious ideology and its later use as a central concept of the Christian faith. The Hebrew word Mashiach, in its literal sense, means anointed, that is, perfumed with precious oil, as a sign of divine election to kingship, or the priesthood in the ancient Near East. Throughout most of the books of the Old Testament, Mashiach means exactly that, a powerful divinity-sanctioned leader. The term is used to describe earthly political personalities like Saul, David, Solomon, and even Cyrus the Great. With the fall of the Israelite kingdom to the Assyrians in 721 BCE, and more particularly with the destruction of the Judean monarchy by the Babylonians about 135 years later, a new concept of the Mashiach arose. With the people of Israel stripped, temporarily, of political independence and divine favor, they began to look forward to a time when a divinely appointed king like David, or perhaps even distant descendant of the Davidic dynasty, would arise to defeat all of Israel's enemies and restore their nostalgically remembered political and economic independence. In other words, to establish from a Judean perspective the reign of God on earth. Is Jesus of Nazareth, however, the Jewish concept of the Messiah, underwent a far-reaching theological transformation. In Jesus of Nazareth, however, the Jewish concept of the Messiah underwent a far-reaching theological transformation. Though the term Christos was a literal Greek translation of the Hebrew Mashiach, and though many of the biblical prophecies were now interpreted as foretelling Jesus' earthly incarnation, little remained of the strictly national political savior of the people of Israel in the otherworldly, apolitical Christ. Gentile Christians, of course, who would now share in the kingdom, saw this transformation as a monumentous spiritual turning point in human history. But in the last 100 years, as historians and biblical scholars have paid more attention to the ancient Jewish sources, this turning point is a lot less clear-cut than it used to be. With the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was seen that Jewish and early Christian conceptions of the Messiah overlapped in many cases. And because the scroll texts were so cryptic and in many cases so fragmentary, any statements about the relationship between Jewish and Christian messianism, between Judaism and early Christianity, were less a matter of clear-cut documentary evidence than of the theological interpretations of a particular faith. As the contents of the first scrolls were gradually made known to the scholarly public in the early 1950s, they were seen to contain some striking correspondences to terms and even concepts that appear in the New Testament. Common to the Qumran community rule and the Gospels were such terms as the light of life, sons of light, and the life eternal. There were numerous references in the community rule, the Damascus document, and the War Scroll to the sect's messianic expectations, and some scholars even saw in the Damascus document an indication that the members of the Qumran community awaited the messianic return of their own teacher of righteousness. The community rule also revealed the centrality of the rite of baptism and the sacred communal meals of the faithful. The pooling of wealth and the adoption of celibacy also suggested similarities to early Christianity. The use of similar organizational terms by the Qumran community and the early church was no less striking. Parallel Hebrew and Greek terms, both translated as the many, where they were used to designate the congregation of all the initiated members of the Dead Sea sect and groups of early followers like Jesus. Likewise, the Qumran community was presided over by a council of 12 lay members and 3 priests, which some scholars have noted corresponded uncannily to the Jerusalem Church's council of the 12 apostles, with James, Cephas, and John as its 3 pillars. Furthermore, the chief administrator of the Qumran community was called the Mevakar, or overseer, which in the literal Greek translation, episkopos, became the title of the bishops of the early Christian communities. In fact, the connections between Qumran and early Christianity were so close that Frank Cross wrote in 1956 that he found it extraordinary that the Essenes are not named in the New Testament. I know of no fully adequate explanation of this circumstance. Others rather quickly came up with the explanations, stressing the differences rather than the similarities. The fear that the scrolls might somehow undermine the spiritual uniqueness of Christianity was real. In his 1955 book, The Dead Sea Scrolls, Professor Burroughs of Yale moved quickly to calm the faithful. It has even been said that the discoveries will revolutionize New Testament scholarship, he wrote. This may perhaps cause some alarm. There is no danger, however, that our understanding of the New Testament will be so revolutionized by the Dead Sea Scrolls as to require a revision of any basic article of Christian faith. More and more, the established scholars placed as much stress on the differences between the doctrines of Qumran and the Church as on the similarities. The community rule and the Damascus document, after all, spoke of hopes for the coming of two messiahs, one priestly and one royal, not a single Davidic one. And although it is certainly true that many of the terms and customs of Qumran were used by the Christians, they were, according to the scholars, given a completely different significance. The Christians preached love to all peoples, not merely fellow members of the community. For the Christians, the Messiah had already come to inaugurate the kingdom of God, while the Qumran text spoke longingly of that event, which was yet to occur. In 1957, Abbe G.T. Millick put it definitively in a statement I have already quoted, insisting that, despite all parallels to the beliefs of the Qumran community, Christianity represents something completely new. More recently, in 1992, Professor James Vanderkam of Notre Dame underlined the difference between the closed, elitist dogma of the Qumran community and the universal message of Christianity. The Qumran scrolls, he wrote, also help to highlight Christianity's uniqueness. This lies not so much in its communal practices and eschatological expectations, but in its confession that the son of a carpenter from Nazareth in Galilee was indeed the Messiah and Son of God, who taught, healed, suffered, died, rose, ascended, and promised to return someday in glory to judge the living and the dead. This is the language of religious belief, not an analytical historical distinction. Indeed, most Dead Sea Scrolls scholars leave little doubt where their own religious sympathies lay. That is not to say that a Jewish or Christian scholar would ever intentionally mistranslate, suppress, or destroy any scroll text that he or she found to be a threat to the faith. Those who suspect complex conspiracies to cover up explosive religious secrets contained in the scrolls do not understand how subjective scroll study really is. The poetic language of the Qumran manuscripts is in many cases cryptic and highly metaphorical. The precise theological meaning of many messianic terms and allusions is extremely unclear. For an international conspiracy to work, its pious agents would have to be able to identify explosive secrets in order to suppress them. And the reality of Qumran study is that almost everything is subject to interpretation. A pious scholar, whether Jewish or Christian, is likely to see only what he or she believes is true. And he or she will likely come away from study of the Dead Sea Scrolls with only heightened appreciation for the historical basis of his or her particular faith. For all the proud talk these days about openness and free access for all interested scholars, you still have to overcome a series of daunting roadblocks to get through the labyrinth of gatekeepers, doorways, padlocks, and inner chambers to arrive at the quiet, cramped room where you can examine the plates of assembled scroll fragments from Qumran Cave 4. There is still a protocol of recognitions, polite nods, and familiar code words conveyed by the right letters of recommendation and the right manner of speaking that one must use to get to the inner sanctum where the hundreds of ancient Hebrew and Aramaic documents are stored. Father Emile Puech of the École Biblique et Archéologique in Jerusalem, one of the leaders in the field of scroll scholarship, agreed to take me to the scrollery to give me a glimpse at the work. Short, dark, with a square, jet-black beard and dark eyes, Puech is alternately patient, passionate, and irritable when it comes to discussing the scrolls. I had met him a year before at the École, and he had taken me down to his small workspace in the school's famed library, though his place was hardly more than the cramped carrel of a normal American graduate student, and he showed me the colleges on which he had made his reputation in the world of Dead Sea Scroll scholarship, opening a large fold-out on which he had carefully pasted together cut-out Xerox copies of scroll fragments. He proceeded with great excitement and with excited sweeping motions of his hand to show how he had rearranged the fragments from position to position. Providing the logic of his transpositions, he read out the new message contained in the rearranged document, identifying it as an angelic liturgy. This was no agent of theological suppression, carefully going over secret documents and suppressing those which he did not like. Emile Puech is a priest who would find it very difficult to identify, much less search for, evidence in the Qumran text that would change the messiahship or even essential uniqueness of Jesus Christ. "I am a peasant, you know," he later told me in his family. Later told me of his family background. "I was with the cows and sheep and vineyards and so on in the south of France, near Estaing, a very well-known village. It is, as Puech proudly informed me, the domain of the very good family of former President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. But even at an early age, this farmer's son decided to devote his life to the church, going off to study theology and Latin in a seminary near Lyon. Puech wanted more than most students. He recalled how, after discovering some old Hebrew books in the seminary attic, he resolved to learn the language by himself. Then, after a period of army service with the French forces in West Germany in the mid-1960s, during which he was a radioman expert in Morse code, which may or may not be significant for his later skill in scroll decipherment, he returned to the seminary, receiving permission from his bishop to go to Paris to study ancient languages. He became the student of the famous Orientalist André de Pont-Sommer, and later the protege of Abbé Jean Starkey, one of the members of the international team. De Pont-Sommer guided Puech's study in ancient Semitic languages, and Starkey bequeathed to him some of the most important Dead Sea Scrolls Aramaic texts. Joining the École Biblique et Archéologique in Jerusalem was just the final stage in Puech's lifelong preparation for bringing the message of the Dead Sea Scrolls to the world. Years before, even just 2 years before, it would have been unthinkable for one of the scroll editors to casually bring a writer into the scrollery and describe the details of important texts that were still unpublished, with the writer's tape recorder running and notebook open, lest he be reprimanded by his colleagues for a gross breach of scroll scholarly discipline. But now the team faced different problems, and maintaining secrecy was not one of them. So on the morning in early June 1993, I drove from West Jerusalem to the École Biblique on the eastern side of the city, picking Puek up outside the closed entrance on Nablus Road. In other times I had known that road leading to the Damascus Gate of the Old City as a crowded, noisy, open-air bus station for the villagers and townsmen coming into the Old City of Jerusalem from the surrounding Arab towns and villages. But now, on a general strike day in the midst of the Intifada, it was largely deserted except for a checkpoint of the Israeli Border Patrol. Passing through the checkpoint, we turned left at the Damascus Gate Plaza and drove to the Rockefeller Museum, on whose octagonal tower an Israeli flag flew, as it had since it became the headquarters of the Israeli Department of Antiquities, soon after the 1967 Six-Day War. The galleries, offices, and back corridors of the museum were my old stomping grounds. I had worked there 20 years before as an enthusiastic archaeological beginner, and somehow I didn't realize how much had changed. The first gatekeeper on the way to see the scrolls was Chief Curator Ruda Palid, a strong, no-nonsense professional, whom I had known since my days working as an assistant in the very same office she now occupied. Almost immediately, however, there was tension and unpleasantness in the confrontation between Puda Palid and Emil Puek, a sudden bit of testiness that struck me as completely unnecessary. Palid, sitting behind her desk, was trying her best to follow the new access procedures, while Puek was showing how displeased he was to have to go through the humiliation of having to make a formal request for access to the scrolls. Until the recent uproar, the change of policy, the scholars of the international team had enjoyed direct and largely unsupervised access to the scrollery. Even after the large scrollery was closed down sometime in the early 1970s, and the small room in the basement storerooms had been put aside for scroll study, the plates of assembled fragments had been placed in flat file drawers for the scholars to browse among them as they pleased. But ever since the big uproar and the widening of access to all interested and qualified scholars, the scroll fragments were more tightly guarded, and even international team members now had to make a specific request for every document they wanted to see. The requirement that a visiting scholar fill out a form and wait for a museum official to bring the requested manuscript into a special study room did not seem to me to be too much of an imposition, and certainly would not ever be questioned at the British Library, the Smithsonian, or the Louvre. Yet Puek seemed to take it as an affront to his dignity, and he agreed each of the administrative innovations. I sense the demonstrations were at least partially for my benefit, with a sullen, even petulant grimace and shake of the head. Riding down the ancient freight elevator to the basement level of the museum, I felt embarrassed to be part of this ritual, not wanting to appear to take the part of either side. In an outer room where we waited for the fragments to be delivered, two restorers were hard at work with surgical tools at a laboratory table, trying to peel away the gummy traces of 1950s Scotch tape from the now blackened surface of the skins. They explained, and I was to learn later, that this was a part of a large-scale preservation effort in which all the fragments would be cleaned and remounted. The traditional system of pressing the manuscripts between panes of glass had been judged to be damaging. They were hereafter to be mounted within artboard mats sewn between two sheets of fine polyester gauze. This would be another, even more disconcerting innovation for scholars set in their ways. Puek and I stood and waited. Next door, in a cramped room, stuffy even now on a cool morning, two well-known scroll scholars were huddling over the plates that had been brought out, one by one, to them. Grudgingly and irritably, Puek had written down a request for 3 manuscripts on a small lined yellow pad that I had handed him in lieu of a more official request form. Though annoyed at having to translate the familiar designations, 4Q521, 4Q525, and 4Q542 were 4Q stood for Qumran K4, into the new inventory numbers that the Israel Antiquity Authority used: 330, 423, and 193. This whole demeanor changed as the documents themselves were finally brought into the study room. Now temporarily mounted between sheets of plexiglass, each document formed a distant pattern of fitted fragments, each of them more a mosaic than an unfinished jigsaw puzzle. The color of the wrinkled, pressed leather varied from pale yellow to rich golden brown. The tiny black Hebrew letters inscribed upon them were, in some cases, breathtakingly clear. The text suddenly became less of an abstraction when you examine them closely enough to see the ancient scribe's skill at forming the letters. A photograph of the same document printed in a book and read in a library reference room has none of the same impact. When you hold a Qumran text plate in your hands and tilt it slightly, you can see the subtle wrinkles and imperfections in the leather, and notice how the light plays off the ink. The boldness or ineptness of the pen strokes, the straightness of the lines, or the sloppiness of the margins all create an indication that an individual had labored over this text, and rightly or wrongly, you almost cannot avoid forming an opinion about his intelligence and personality. For Puek, the ragged pieces of inscribed ancient leather bearing the early messianic message were first of all a challenge to his ingenuity. Only secondarily were they a challenge to his faith. He explained that Starkey had only begun the process of putting the pieces together, and he had later been able to locate 8 more of its pieces from unidentified fragment plates. Jabbing his finger toward various areas of the 3 reconstructed columns, Puek gave me a lesson in manuscript geography. This was not so complicated here, but this is complicated, and this small part was very complicated, and this was a problem. Here you have a perfect join, but here, because it is curved, it doesn't fit anymore. It shrunk. But you have the remains of letters here and there. When you put the whole thing together, I put this one above this one to get the same contour. This was certainly not meant to be a systematic introduction to Cave 4 collection. It was to be just an impression of the kinds of textual problems that Puek routinely faced. The first document we examined consisted of 3 fragmentary columns that Starkey had originally titled On Resurrection, and which Puek had later renamed the Messianic Apocalypse. Though it's an ancient title, was unknown, its contents were extremely important, for it foretold of a real change beyond the Holy War and political revolution seen in most of the other messianic references. It envisioned a transformation in spiritual affairs and the well-being of humanity. Here is the quote. "The heavens and the earth will obey his Messiah, the sea and all that is in them. He will not turn aside from the commandment of the holy ones." Take strength in his mighty word, in his mighty work, all ye who seek the Lord. Will you not find the Lord in this, all ye who wait for him with hope in your hearts? Surely the Lord will seek out the pious, and will call the righteous by name. His spirit will hover over the poor. By his might he will restore the faithful. He will glorify the pious on the throne of the eternal kingdom. He will release the captives, make the blind see, raise up the downtrodden. The piece of scripture is removed at that point, where it's the second half of the word downtrodden. Anyway, end of the quote. This elegantly written Hebrew poem went on to describe the future coming of a heaven-sent Messiah who would heal the sick, resurrect the dead, and bring glad tidings to the poor. But was this just pious Sunday pew poetry, or did it represent a real expectation, a response to the conditions of this world? Despite the continuing attempts to separate Qumran messianism from Christianity, the acts of releasing captives, giving sight to the blind, and raising the downtrodden appeared in identical sequence in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke as the hallmarks of Jesus' ministry. Yet Puick was unwilling to exaggerate the importance of those mere literary connections. He took issue with the opinion that the poem referred to a single Messiah like Jesus, and preferred to believe that it referred to the more characteristic multiple Messiahs attested elsewhere at Qumran. And as for the references to healing, resurrection, and bringing good tidings, Puick preferred to ascribe them not to Qumran's Messiahs, but to God. And when we looked at the other documents that had been brought into the room for our examination, he went on to provide technical and textual explanations of the Testament of Qahat, with its fierce, anti-foreign polemic, and a wisdom text with Beatitudes, with its striking parallels to the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, seeing each one as a possible literary model for the early Christian literature, yet of little religious value in themselves. So what did it all add up to, these ingeniously assembled leather mosaics of ancient Jewish poetry and prayer? When I asked Puick about the possible direct links between the Qumran sect and early Christians, he was hesitant and cautious, suddenly bridling his enthusiasm. I can't say too much because I still have to think it out for myself, but my opinion, my hypothesis of work, he answered, in a pious speculation that mirrored his own theological preference, is that I am sure that many Essenes converted to Christianity, without reference to the complex social and political upheavals of Judea in the first century. He based his larger interpretation on faith. He suggested that they may simply have gotten tired of waiting for the return of their teacher of righteousness and joined the Church of Jesus Christ. As for the possibility of influence in the other direction, that the Qumran sect could have shaped the ideas or message of Jesus, he was certain it could not have happened. Jesus didn't know much about Qumran, Puek explained, in an even more imaginative yet still faith-filled assumption about the relation of Qumran beliefs and the messianism to earliest Christianity. To enter, you had to be a member of the sect. Maybe he knew that it existed, but he never went in. This was a supposition utterly consistent with Puek's belief that the Qumran sect and Jesus' followers were separate. Where one was exclusive and isolationist, the other was open and unselfish in its brotherly love. The advantages of the gospel of Jesus Christ were to him self-evident. His interpretations, certainly based on skillful, learned, ingenious textual construction, were nevertheless all aimed at illustrating a religious assertion, not a proven fact of history. The Gospels proclaim that Jesus Christ was the single true Messiah, the center point of all human history. That is the faith of every Christian. But here is the problem for those who also call themselves independent critical scholars. In dealing with a vast quantity of newly discovered religious literature from first-century Judea, doesn't a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar have an obligation at least to consider that these ancient manuscripts might provide evidence that many of the gospel stories about Jesus are not true? There is another historical possibility, perhaps a better explanation of the relationship between the people of Qumran and the followers of Jesus of Nazareth. The close similarities in organization and terminology may lie in the fact that both these groups were part of a vast popular movement in Judea, with many factions, leaders, and philosophies. By movement, I do not mean to imply that these groups saw themselves as organizationally united. Far from it. There are undoubtedly fierce rivalries and bitter disputes between them, but in the sense that these groups all expressed a common passion for resistance to Rome and an anticipation of divinely aided liberation, their similarities, to outside non-Judean observers, would have far outweighed their differences in details of terminology or even ritual, like the popular movements that gave rise to the medieval peasants' rebellions or to the French, Russian, and Iranian revolutions. The scattered yet widespread messianic groups in first-century Judea shared similar, if not always identical, political and social goals. And it should be noted that many of the messianic themes and terms that are common to the Qumran literature and the New Testament are also prominent in the ancient descriptions of the violent anti-Roman activists in first-century Judea, people variously called zealots, bandits, and knifemen, or Sicarii. Josephus Flavius, the aristocratic Jewish turncoat historian, who could never be accused of an excess of sympathy for revolutionary movements among his people, related regretfully after the Roman sack of Jerusalem that what more than all else incited the Jews to the war was an ambiguous oracle, likewise found in their sacred scriptures, to the effect that at that time one from their country would become ruler of the world. The clearest scriptural basis for this was one of Balaam's oracles, quoted in Numbers 24:17, that someday a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, to conquer the world. The Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius also mention the messianic prophecy as an important source of incitement for the Jewish revolt. The fact is that Jesus of Nazareth was but one of a long line of working-class prophets and would-be saviors who ended up in Roman custody. The pattern was similar in almost every case. a charismatic messianic prophet, arose at a time of intensifying Roman political pressure, called the masses to leave their fields, their shops, their employers, and accompany him to the wilderness. There great miracles were made manifest, clear omens that the age of redemption was about to begin. Almost inevitably, the Roman authorities responded to these mass gatherings and demonstrations as if they were hostile political actions, sending the cavalry to scatter the crowds and trample the confused and frightened men, women, and children who were desperate enough and poor enough, really, to believe in the Messianic age. A number of scholars have stressed how this intensifying messianism must be viewed both as a development of biblical tradition and a conscious response to the rise of the cult of the emperor. Until 27 BCE, the Romans were, for the Judeans, just another Hellenistic kingdom with a powerful army that had brought Judea under its control. The installation of their protege, the client King Herod, in 37 BCE was nothing new. But in 27 BCE, the Roman warlord Octavian renamed himself Augustus and declared himself Son of God and World Savior, creating the focus of civic worship that would preserve and promote the eternal power of Rome. For those people in all walks of life who benefited from Roman civilization, the cult of the emperor was no more or less important than reciting a pledge of allegiance. But for many of those who sincerely wanted the emperor dead and the empire in ruins, the cult of the emperor was an insult, a blasphemy. King Herod, who was poised uncomfortably between Rome and the people of Judea, managed to keep the cult of the emperor out of Jewish territory, except for a symbolic eagle on the gate of the Jerusalem temple. His lavish devotion to the welfare of Augustus was made manifest elsewhere with the establishment of two important cities, Caesarea and Sebaste, whose very names and whose elaborate temples to the emperor made his ultimate political allegiance unmistakable. But after the death of Herod and the exile of his heir Archelaus in 6 CE, Judea came under the direct rule of the Romans. Individual Judeans in all walks of life would now be required to pay homage to the emperor. A census was to be taken, an oath of allegiance administered, and daily sacrifices were henceforth to be offered in the Temple of Jerusalem for the health and well-being of Caesar in Rome. 174 years before the annexation of Judea to the Roman Empire in 168 BCE, the Syrian Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes and his local supporters had similarly attempted to abolish the cultural autonomy of the Israelite religion and replace it with a Hellenistic king cult. But the results of this experiment in compulsory patriotism were disastrous: rioting, guerrilla war, and the rise of an independent Judean state under the Maccabees. At the time of the Roman annexation, there seems to have been widespread popular support for a replay of the Maccabean triumph, but this time in 6 CE. The bloody national uprising, led by would-be national saviors in various parts of the country, was quickly and cruelly suppressed. Thus, the Messianic movement went underground, and it developed not as a steady spiritual refinement becoming ever more transcendent and moral, but as an up and down, rising and falling index of popular resentment to Rome. Through the first century CE, in times of particularly intense repression or taxation, the messianic vision would flame brightly, focusing ever more sharply on the single, long-awaited Messiah that would free the people of Israel. In times of relative calm and material prosperity, it would become more diffuse, perhaps more directed toward inner spiritual life. But whatever its form, it was a religious, political, and economic projection of the world of the present. The force of its message was revolutionary change. That brings us to the most popular and influential book on the Dead Sea Scrolls ever written, a book that attempted to establish a direct link between the ideology of the scrolls and of Jesus, between the ancient Judean gospel of independence and the revolutionary movements of our own day. Its author was Edmund Wilson, a crusty, often acerbic American writer and literary critic who personified a chic, 1950s Manhattan-based intellectual iconoclasm that was the New Yorker magazine, stock in trade. Wilson's interest in the Bible, his liberal aversion to established religions, and his fascination with the Hebrew language, which he studied briefly in the early 1950s at Princeton, sharpened his interest in the recent scroll discoveries, and in the spring of 1954, in expectation of an intriguing feature story, the New Yorker sent him on assignment to Jordan and Israel. Unlike other scroll books, past and present, Wilson is not a deadpan dissertation, but a fascinating stream of consciousness journey that wends its way from America to Paris, to the new state of Israel, with its influx of immigrants and puzzling clash of modern ideas and unbending religious traditions. Through the border checkpoint at Mandelbaum Gate, amid the no-man's land of Geshed and gutted houses, between Arab and Jewish Jerusalem, and finally to the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, to the scrollery in Rockefeller Museum, the Christian shrines of the Old City of Jerusalem, and the arid western shore of the Dead Sea. Wilson had an eye for detail in his descriptions of the actors in the Dead Sea Scroll story. First he met Archbishop Samuel, now at home with his American congregants in Hackensack, New Jersey, with his black and abundant beard, his large liquid brown eyes, in his onion-shaped black satin mitre. Later, the white-robed Dominican friar, Father Roland DeVoe, at the Qumran excavations. He tells stories extremely well, continually smokes cigarettes, and altogether has style, even dash, and in Israel, the outrageously outspoken scholar David Flausser. A short, stocky man with sharp little cold green eyes and that glint behind rimless glasses under modestly Mephistophelian eyebrows, and red hair that stands straight up from his forehead. In his vivid character descriptions, Wilson showed his readers that Dead Sea Scroll study was not a serene contemplation of Scripture, but an ongoing, sometimes angry, theological debate. Divine revelation had no attraction for Wilson. His was a humanist faith in the ability of mankind to improve itself, while the rest of America was being lulled to sleep in their suburbs by Norman Vincent Peale, Billy Graham, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Wilson had already offered a powerful reshaping of biblical symbols in his 1953 piece in The New Yorker, on first reading Genesis, in which he applied his skill as a literary critique to the stories of the Israelite patriarchs, seeing them as epics of struggle and survival by determined individuals, not pious fairy tales. In the same way, he saw the literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls as more than liturgical or legal works of an obscure Jewish sect, but an important stage in the spiritual evolution of humanity. He did not come to that realization without considerable input from the scholars. For Wilson, the most influential among them was Professor André de Pont-Sommer of the Sorbonne, a tutor of several generations of would-be scroll scholars, who was not a member of the international team, but who, nonetheless, sent shockwaves through the academic establishment. On May 26, 1950, de Pont-Sommer presented a paper to the August Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres in Paris on the text of the Habakkuk community found in Cave 1, and whose complete text had been published only a short time before in New Haven by the American Schools of Oriental Research. As I mentioned in an earlier chapter, the Habakkuk commentary is a document of 12 damaged columns which intersperses quotations from the book of Habakkuk, with descriptions of later events that seemingly fulfilled the ancient prophecies. Thus, where the biblical text prophesies the fearsome rampage of Chaldeans, the author of the Habakkuk commentary sees its fulfillment in the dominion of the Kittim, where the ancient prophet speaks abstractly of the fate of the righteous and the wicked. The commentator speaks of the careers of the sect's own teacher of righteousness, and of someone known as the wicked priest. Scholars had long attempted to connect these characters with historical figures known from other sources, and the consensus was that the teacher of righteousness was a dissident priest from the Jerusalem temple who established the Qumran sect around 150 BCE. The teacher arch-enemy was believed to be one of the early Hasmonean rulers, perhaps Jonathan, 160 to 143 BCE, or Simon, 142 to 134. There were hints in the Habakkuk commentary, as well as in the Damascus document, and perhaps even in the Thanksgiving hymns, that the teacher of righteousness was pursued and killed by the wicked priest, and the teacher was thereafter remembered and venerated as a righteous martyr by the Qumran community. There was a chronological problem with this interpretation, since the mention of the dominion of the Kittim, almost unanimously identified with the Romans who invaded Judea in 63 BCE, seemed to refer to events almost a century later than the deadly encounter between the teacher of righteousness and the wicked priest. The usual explanation was that the Habakkuk commentary was indeed composed at the time of the Romans, but referred to an event in the distant past that was of unique spiritual significance to the sect. André de Pont-Sommer disputed the conventional dating of the events, placing all the characters at the time of the Roman invasion. But he saw in the events and descriptions a shockingly familiar pattern. This Dead Sea Scroll told of a spiritual teacher who preached penitence, poverty, humility, chastity, and love of one's brother, who received direct revelations from God, was persecuted and put to death by the priestly establishment, and, at least according to de Pont-Sommer's interpretation of a cryptic passage in the Damascus document, was expected to return to earth as a messianic figure at the end of days. De Pont-Sommer's conclusions was shocking to a world that dated its years from the beginning of a supposedly divine and unique Messiah. Yet that Galilean master, as he is presented to us in the writings of the New Testament, de Pont-Sommer asserted, appears in many respects as an astonishing reincarnation of the teacher of righteousness. Through a number of de Pont-Sommer's assumptions were based on dubious readings of several of the broken lines in the original manuscript. His theory of a hidden predecessor to Jesus, when transfigured by Wilson and published first in the New Yorker and later in book form from the Scrolls from the Dead Sea, posed a direct challenge to the historical and implicitly spiritual uniqueness of Christianity. For Wilson, the Qumran New Covenant was a revolutionary spiritual development in its adherents' resistance to the ossified religious establishment of Jerusalem and to the wicked earthly greed of the Romans, and in their expectation of imminent divine deliverance from sin and injustice lay the foundations of the New Testament. We can see how the movement represented by the Essenes, Wilson wrote, stood up for perhaps 2 centuries to the coercion of the Greeks and the Romans, and how it resisted not only the methods of Rome, but also the Roman ideals. This, Wilson believed, was the true birth of a spirit of conscious resistance to political and cultural domination. The revolutionary spirit of Russia he saw and admired in Lenin, in his bestseller To the Finland Station, as the world's first genuine revolutionaries, unbounded by temple worship or political subservience. The Qumran sect had, according to Wilson, made itself free to range through the whole ancient world, touching souls with the gospel of purity and light to which the Brotherhood had consecrated itself. The teaching, the contempt of those eagles which they had noted with evident astonishment that the army of their enemy worshipped. Wilson went far beyond what the scholars told him, far beyond anything that they would have imagined themselves. His call for a reawakening of a lost spirit of resistance and fierce pride in freedom, political and religious, obviously struck a sympathetic chord in the public consciousness, as the Scrolls from the Dead Sea remained near the top of the bestseller list from the time of its publication in the fall of 1955 until the summer of 1956. Wilson wrote at a time when Mr. Levitt was building little boxes in meadows soon to be suburbs, and America's idea of religion was a crusade against the Red Menace. Billy Graham's shouted sermons, the power of positive thinking, and the numbing conformity. But here was a gospel of liberation that was based more on the will to freedom than metaphysical doctrine. The monastery, Wilson wrote of the excavated ruins of Qumran, that he had so recently visited, and which, for him, now served as an archaeological object for spiritual contemplation, this structure of stone that endures between the bitter waters and the precipitous cliffs, with its oven and its inkwells, its mill and its cesspool, its constellation of sacred fonts, and the unadorned graves of its dead, is perhaps more than Bethlehem or Nazareth, the cradle of Christianity. Few Dead Sea Scroll scholars that I have ever talked to have dared to speculate on the possibility that the scrolls might provide evidence for a thorough revision of New Testament history. To venture into these dangerous realms of historical speculation is to risk being called a maverick or an eccentric, or worse yet, an enemy of the Church. Most still prefer to remain in the safer and more familiar pastures of paleography and close textual analysis, leaving ultimate historical conclusions for the future, which is another way of evading them. And while most scholars speak on the subject with only great circumspection, one of the chief characters of Edmund Wilson's book, Professor David Flusser of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, has always had a lot to say about Wilson. His theories, the religious significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and their connection to Christianity. Flusser, born in Czechoslovakia and settled permanently in Israel since 1950, made an indelible impression on Wilson. One of the most memorable passages in Wilson's book in his colorful description of a conversation with Flusser in the lobby lounge of the King David Hotel on the evening of March 31st, 1954. "I have rarely known a scholar," wrote Wilson, "who expressed himself with all the material at his fingertips so brilliantly and so much to the point. He would give me, to each of my questions, a full and closely reasoned answer, and stop when he had covered the ground." But there was more to Flusser's personality than a brilliant scholarship. Such were the pressure and tempo of Mr. Flusser's talk, Wilson continued, that he was carried at one point to lengths and had no parallel in my experience of even the most enthusiastic talkers. Not only did he raise his voice when some insight had taken possession of him, quite oblivious of the people sitting near us, and as if he were lecturing in a classroom, but when, at the climax of one of his arguments, though we tried to get away from the orchestra by going to the farthest corner, the music impinged on our conversation. My companion, caught up by a familiar tune, actually sang a few bars of his exposition, as if it were part of an opera. The libretto of that Flusserian opera was that the Dead Sea Scrolls, in their apocalyptic message that God had preordained redemption and renewal as the climax of human history, and that he had designated the Sons of Light to help bring it about, was the beginning of a tradition of revolutionary arrogance that led from the teacher of righteousness through Paul to Spinoza, Calvin, Hegel, and Marx. This concept was, according to Flusser's characteristically sardonic overstatement, one of the most disastrous of human ideas. When I went to the quiet, respectable neighborhood of the Talbia in West Jerusalem to interview David Flusser, I found that he still had a powerful message to convey. More than 40 years have passed since that memorial evening with Edmund Wilson. Yet I found that Flusser still enjoys the notoriety that Wilson bestowed upon him in the mid-1950s, and he is ready to be called upon by visitors and offer more of his provocative epigrams. Our meeting took place around a large table in the book-lined study of his ground-floor apartment, late on a Friday morning, in the aroma of that evening's Sabbath dinner already filling the air. Though now in his mid-70s and paunchy and gray, Flusser can still show flashes of the old passion, wheezing out witty asides in a steady stream of heavily accented commentary and pontification, working his way through my questions at his own pace and ending what amounted to a series of monologues only when he was satisfied that he was done. By the end of our conversation, I discovered, or at least suspected, that Flusser's fabled cynicism was and always had been just a protective mask for an idealism that has been bruised too often by reality. The Wilson book was almost our first object of conversation, and Flusser has no illusions about how he was portrayed by Wilson. In that book is the famous talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, where he described me as a kind of humoristic Pickwick, and I had with this a strange story, as he said about me, that I am not obliged to any religion, and it is not true. Flusser was referring to what amounted to Wilson's offhanded and certainly admiring statement that while the theological implications of the scrolls might be unsettling to both Christian clerics and Orthodox Jews, an independent scholar like Flusser, not committed to any religion, had no reason for being upset. He was, even now, upset at the comment. I don't know if I changed my opinion very much since that time, Flusser admitted. But surely I'm obliged to the Jewish faith, the Jewish religion. At first, I decided that I didn't want to protest because he portrayed me so stupidly, as if Hamlet would protest against Shakespeare. My description is a description of a personality who he needed, so he strained reality. I didn't want to protest, but my friends said, "How can you allow it?" And I decided to write to him because of those friends. But the gods of art and poetry saved me. I have written a letter to him saying that I am surely obliged to the Jewish religion, but as I said, Apollo has saved me. I addressed the letter to Edmund Wilson at New Yorker and not the New Yorker, and several months later I received the letter back stamped, not at Hotel New Yorker. So I am until now in his book and not obliged to any religion, and he was from this point of view right. Yes. Yes? Because men don't know how to read. Even though he was wrong, he was right, because I am surely not obliged to any revealed religion. Wilson's description, Flusser admitted, was not bad, but not completely me. Flusser would never claim to be a revolutionary, but neither has he ever been a member of the inner circle. Despite his reputation as a scholar of early Christianity and his long association with the scrolls, he was never given access, even as a professional courtesy, to texts that were of direct relevance to his work. He now told me another story, or should I say parable? This one about a Qumran text known as 4Q 246. Despite the assurances of the international team over the years that they had published most of the really important documents from Cave 4, now and then news leaked out of some intriguing new discoveries. Such was the case in December 1972 when J.T. Millick, invited to Harvard for a series of lectures, revealed some of the contents, a 2-column fragment in Aramaic in which a seer, possibly the prophet Daniel, interprets the dream of a king. The truly remarkable part of this fragment, dated by Millick to the 1st century BCE, was that the dream interpretation centered on the future appearance of an individual who will be called Son of God and Son of the Most High. Since these were precisely the titles the angel Gabriel used in the Gospel of Luke to describe the coming of Jesus at the time of his Annunciation to the Virgin Mary, their occurrence in a Qumran document was of the highest significance. The more common messianic titles used at Qumran were the dual messiahs of Aaron and Israel, mentioned in the community rule, and the Damascus document. But since Millick had not officially published the document, its full contents and context remain secret, except for the few crumbs that Millick was willing to toss to the scholarly world. Who knew what other messianic secrets were contained in the hundreds of still unpublished documents from Cave 4? Father Joseph Fitzmyer, a junior member of the international team, was in the audience at Millick's Harvard lecture, and he took the then daring step of mentioning this striking parallel between Qumran and the New Testament in an article and later in his commentary on Luke. But here was the heart of the matter. Millet believed that the titles had nothing to do with a Messiah, but were a mocking reference to the Syrian king Alexander, Balis, 150 to 145 BCE, who, like a number of Hellenistic despots, proclaimed his own divinity. Fitzmyer, on the other hand, saw the terms as more likely referring to a future heir of the Davidic throne, though he was reluctant to ascribe them to a messianic figure. When Flusser saw published reports about this document, he had a third, typically heretical theory that Son of God and Son of the Most High were the derisive titles to be used by an evil figure like the Antichrist or of later Christian literature. Flusser published his theory in a 1983 article entitled The Hubris of Antichrist in a fragment from Qumran, reproducing and translating the lines that Fitzmyer had published. Here is the quote. He will be great on the earth, and will worship, and all will serve him. Great he shall be called, and by his name he shall be designated. He shall be named Son of God, and they shall call him Son of the Most High, like a shooting star. Of a vision, so shall be their kingdom. They shall reign for some years on the earth and trample everything. One nation shall trample on another nation, and one province on another province, until the people of God shall rise, and all will desist from the sword. Flusser stressed that the absolute duality of light and darkness, of righteousness and wickedness in the Qumran sect's apocalyptic worldview made it possible that the text referred to the wars and rumors of wars, brought on by the forces of evil that would plague the earth in the last days. Thus he argued, though there were a number of scholars who would later contest this interpretation, that the Son of God and Son of the Most High were the arrogant and mistaken appellation of the leader of the sons of darkness in the world. But because Flusser did not have access to the remaining lines, he could not tell if the end of the text mentioned the rise of a God-sent Messiah or contained any other evidence that would explain how the titles found their way into the Gospel of Luke. Here was an intriguing question about the relationship of Qumran to Christianity, of Jewish messianism to the role of Jesus, but the rules of the Dead Sea Scroll game did not permit such questions to be pursued. By 1972, Millet had kept the fragment for 2 decades without permitting outside scholars to see it. By the time Flusser wrote his article about it, another decade had passed. It was permitted to publish such lines as were already published, Flusser told me, and it was permitted to see those parts of the scrolls that were already published, as already Millet and Fitzmyer read it, until the line I mentioned, but not beyond. So I wanted to see the original, the non-published part of the fragment. I wanted to see what was written there to see if it didn't contradict what I had seen. He was permitted to examine the original, and then I did a thing which is surely not criminal, but it was not then permitted. I had taken with me an excerpt in paleography, and he read with me quickly the unpublished lines. This was the absurd situation that I was permitted to read only up to the line which was published by these scholars, but I read what was forbidden to me to publish. Now you can see a part of a difficult situation, he concluded, that it is not completely finished today. Flusser now adopted the cynical conviction that the study of the scroll's possible connection to Jesus and early Christianity ultimately did not matter much at all. It is some days ago that a group of men of industry from Stuttgart came here and wanted to hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls, he told me. It was impossible to say to them anything because they wanted to believe, and they said to me that the evidence is so strong that nothing could calm them. But I said that even if it would be written in some document that the mother of Jesus was a harlot and that Jesus was homosexual, even if it would be true, it wouldn't change Christianity, because some experts could say it was not true. Many years ago, a man from BBC came to me, Flusser continued, and he asked me if the Dead Sea Scrolls will harm Christianity. I said to him that nothing can harm Christianity. The only thing which could be dangerous to Christianity would be to find a tomb with the sarcophagus or ossuary of Jesus, still containing his bones. And then I said, I surely hope that it will not be found in the territory of the State of Israel. These anecdotes were amusing, yet there was something entirely unconvincing in Flusser's cynical assertion that the quest for the historical Jesus was pointless. Flusser had spent his career studying the historical relationship of Judaism to Christianity, and had on occasion written powerfully and movingly about the legacy of hatred and bloodshed that sprang from Christian anti-Semitism. As a Jewish refugee from Eastern Europe, he didn't have to learn the lesson from graduate school seminars. His genuine, world-weary skepticism had attracted Edmund Wilson's fascination and even sympathy. But he wanted to convey to me the larger point about the revolutionary nature of Jewish messianism. There is a short story written by Anatole France, he told me. He was a French writer whose name you maybe don't know. Very good for the education of children. You see, France has written a short story with the title The Procurator of Judea. Of course, he didn't know that this was not the correct title of Pilate, who was not a procurator, but a prefectus, as we know from the Caesarea inscription. But Flusser's main point was not archaeological. He conveyed to me the main outlines of France's story with obvious relish, describing how the fictional Roman nobleman, L. alias Lamia, happened to meet and spend an evening with the aged, bloated, and gout-plagued Pontius Pilate, now enjoying a quiet retirement in Sicily after his stormy 10 years of governor in Judea. Pilate sadly recounted to Lamia how his public career was cut short by backbiting rivals in the imperial service and the whispers of a powerful Jewish lobby in the capital, even though he had always tried his best to further the majestic ideals of the Pax Romana, and was always unselfishly committed to honoring the divinity of the emperor. The people of Judea, Pilate grumbled, had rejected all the blessings of technology and prosperity that Rome had to offer. For some reason, they stubbornly, inexplicably maintained their adherence to primitive, ancestral customs and to a peculiarly jealous national god. Pilate was convinced that the Jews posed a mortal danger to the serenity of Roman rule, and a war of extermination would someday be inevitable. For if the Jews were permitted to challenge the divine right of Romans to come to conquer and rule all the world's peoples, the consequences for Roman power would be dire. If the Jews were not taught a lesson, would-be rebels might be emboldened to rise in other parts of the empire, because of the unbending rebelliousness of the Judean people. Pilate insisted from bitter personal experience, Jerusalem must someday be leveled and its temple put to the torch. Lamia, who had visited Judea many years before in the course of a youthful period of exile, now spoke up in defense of this stiff-necked people, expressing some admiration for their men's devotion to national ideals and national religion, and no less significant for this Roman patrician admiring their women's exotic Semitic sensuality. Lamia nostalgically, wistfully recalled his steamy encounters many years before with a seductive, red-haired Jewish dancing girl, apparently Mary Magdalene, from the details of the description, whom he had once ardently pursued in the taverns and back alleys of Jerusalem. But Lamia also recalled that this dancer had suddenly disappeared from her usual haunts to join, so he heard, the ragtag band of followers of a young Galilean miracle worker, someone named Jesus from Nazareth. In idle curiosity, Lamia casually asked Pilate if he remembered anything about the miracle worker who was later crucified for some crime or another. But the aged Pilate, despite all his knowledge of the political affairs of Judea and all his awareness of its looming dangers to the Roman Empire, drew a complete blank on the name Jesus. Pilate murmured, racking his brain to recall this obscure person. Jesus of Nazareth? I cannot call him to mind. David Flusser leaned back in satisfaction when he reached the punchline of Anatole France's story. This time, his usual mocking and cynical style did not conceal the important point he wanted to make. The biographical details of an incarnated Messiah were irrelevant to Judaism's timeless revolutionary message. Flusser chuckled again at Pontius Pilate's inability to remember an obscure Galilean named Jesus. "It is so," Flusser said, nodding toward me. "It is so." It is because of John Marco Allegro that most Dead Sea Scroll scholars have always reacted to serious discussions of Jesus and early Christianity with suspicion and nervous hostility. The memories of John Marco Allegro, by those who knew him and worked with him most closely, are invariably bitter. Words like dishonest and amoral slip easily off the tongues of those who refuse to be pinned down to almost any definite statement on the nature of the scrolls. In fact, it was Allegro, far more than Dupont Sommer or Edmund Wilson, who fostered a perception in the minds of the general public that the scrolls contained some explosive information about the character and life of Jesus, and that the pious members of the international team, knowingly or unknowingly, were suppressing the historical implications of the discovery. Allegro appears as prominently as DeVoe or Harding in the memories of the members of the international team. Frank Cross remembered his first meeting Allegro and recalled him as a very cocky character with sometimes wry wit and sometimes mordant wit. Very quickly, I discovered that he could not tell the truth about anything, and as the years passed, it was clear that he created his own world. John Strugnell knew him from Oxford in the early 1950s, when they had been students together at Godfrey's Driver's Seminar. Strugnell knew him then as Gunner Allegro, for he was a World War II Navy veteran, considerably older than his classmates, and with a far more cynical view of the world. Immediately after the war, Allegro had intended to become a Methodist minister and had studied theology, but later he turned away from the church. His talent for languages and knowledge of biblical literature would in time be used as weapons to attack what he considered to be the superstition and outmoded mythologies. And it is a testimony to Allegro's intelligence and personal presence that he never managed to get as far as he did in the world of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He always teased me for my religious interest, John Strugnell remembered, suggesting that Allegro always had a secret religious vendetta. Later on, when he wrote these things about me, that in a couple of years the church will be destroyed, it had just become a little more specific. It was clear from the start to Strugnell that Allegro's scholarship on the scrolls was inspired and motivated by his atheism. In the first division of fragments in the scrollery, Allegro had been given the biblical commentaries. Unlike the biblical books given to Cross and Skehan, where the big discoveries were tiny textual variations, obvious only to specialists or in the community's mystical apocalyptic text, that had been given to Millet, the biblical commentaries from Qumran dealt with the description of historical events. Quoting line by line from the words of the ancient prophets, the Qumran commentators showed how the misfortunes they were now suffering were actually fulfillments of prophecy. The commentary on Habakkuk, with its reference to the wicked priest, the Kittim, and the fateful confrontation on the Day of Atonement, led to the kind of speculations about the history of the Qumran community that had filled Edmund Wilson's book. Allegro, however, now studying other commentaries, like the commentary on Nahum, with an explicit reference to crucifixion, went far beyond what Edmund Wilson had done. Instead of seeing the Qumran sect as the moral foundation from which Christianity later refined its message, Allegro suggested that Qumran's vision of a teacher of righteousness who would return as the Messiah represented a common, if benighted, first-century Judean superstition. Jesus Christ was just a latter-day variation of a rather tired religious hallucination, and John Allegro, never one to keep his religious opinions to himself when there was an opportunity to broadcast them widely, first presented his heretical Dead Sea Scrolls theories to the general public in a series of BBC programs in 1956. The broadcasts were made on Allegro's own initiative, without consulting or even informing the other members of the international team. And for the international team in Jerusalem, Allegro's broadcast, with their imaginative speculations about myth and messianism in first-century Judea, were a cause for outrage and immediate action. It is a measure of how deeply concerned the scroll scholars were with authority, orthodoxy, and discipline that they immediately clubbed together with an official statement to the London Times rather than responding one by one in an ongoing scholarly debate. I think we got the news of the Allegro broadcast from the English newspapers, John Strugnell remembered, and we had a little meeting and decided that we really should suggest that there was a certain measure of hypothesis in this, and it wasn't all as solid as he might pretend. So I wrote the draft of a letter to the Times, in the style of letters to the Times, your humble servant, and things like this. Over the signature of DeVoe, Millick, Skehan, Starkey, and Strugnell, the letter denied that there was any close connection between the supposed crucifixion of the teacher of righteousness, of the Essene sect, and the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It was the scholar's conclusion that Allegro had misread the text, or he had built up a chain of conjectures, which the materials do not support. Although Allegro at first responded to the accusations of the other team members coolly and politely, his antagonism to his colleagues grew with time. Perhaps his theories were mistaken in some of their details, but he was determined to make the larger questions about the scrolls and their relationship to the origins of Christianity the center of the debate. For Allegro, as for other would-be rebels in the Dead Sea Scrolls story, details were not as important as ideas. Through the 1950s and 1960s, he became ever more firmly convinced that early Christianity was a fraudulent mimic of the faith of the Qumran community, and it should therefore be abandoned as an outmoded myth by right-thinking people everywhere. In letters to DeVoe, he mocked what he believed to be the dilemma of a faithful Christian scholar confronted with the evidence of the scrolls. Your religious convictions seem to me to wrap your judgment slightly on any matter remotely connected with Christianity, he noted with a tone of modernist condescension. This I can expect fully, and expect nothing else. And so the battle was joined in the coming years, with Allegro devoted his career to what amounted to a humanist crusade to prove the emptiness of the idea of the unique revelation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. For him, however, the messianic belief of the Qumran community was no more attractive than Christianity. It was useful primarily to show the modern Christian public that they had been lied to for 2,000 years about the historical uniqueness of their faith. The goal of Allegro's work had always been a kind anti-evangelicism, clearing away the deadwood is the first condition of intellectual progress. Allegro wrote in 1964, but whether this generation has courage or vision to grasp the opportunities of reassessment offered by these miraculous discoveries in the Judean wilderness remains to be seen. Unlike Edmund Wilson, with his elegant prose, or even David Flusser, with his humorously cynical anecdotes that challenged the unconventional wisdom, Allegro grew more militant and more strident as time went on. After 1968, when he finished the publication of his assigned texts, one of the very few team members ever to do so, he confirmed his reputation as an enemy of organized religion with a series of books attacking what he called the myth of the chosen people, and characterizing all divine worship as a hindrance to human progress in a book he titled, ominously, The End of the Road. But the topper came in 1970 with his book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. In it, he claimed that the scrolls and other ancient Near Eastern religious writings revealed that early Christianity was nothing more, nothing less than a drug-addled, orgiastic fertility cult. Needless to say, the scholarly ridicule was vicious, eventually forcing him to leave his faculty position at the University of Manchester. And when Allegro died in 1980, he was regarded by most as an eccentric gadfly whose theories had been thoroughly disproved. Yet there is something that cannot be so easily dismissed in the idea that the scrolls, being contemporary, unrevised religious literature of first-century Judea, provide evidence about the beliefs of Jesus and his followers that were later transformed and concealed by later generations of Christians, scribes, and theologians. Belief in the imminent advent of Israel's Messiah or Messiahs as the secret hope, faith, and shared secret reaction of every Judean and Galilean who did not benefit directly from participation in the Roman provincial regime. And in times of famine, expropriation, and intensifying urbanization of the rural population, it was an image that would come to mind every time a Roman soldier or official exercised his power. Every time a Roman governor attempted to alter the religious status quo, the Messiah would not be a metaphysical savior, but a down-to-earth leader, and the hope for national salvation. And its eventual translation into violent political action grew more desperate as the Roman administration of the province grew more and more determined to pacify the Judeans once and for all. Judean society in the first century of the Common Era was badly fragmented, with many religious sects, leaders, and theological possibilities. And while it can be argued that each of the groups was quite different, the general similarities also force us to recognize that they all shared a single overall ideology of resistance, often elaborated down to the tiniest details. This was the story of how the righteous remnant of Israel would recognize its sins through the appearance and preaching of a prophet who spoke of the advent of the Messianic age. The historical Jesus of Nazareth, born about the time of the death of the tyrant King Herod, and growing to manhood at the time of Pontius Pilate, shared with his Judean contemporaries a fairly standard set of symbols and expectations. The followers of Jesus, of John the Baptist, and the teacher of righteousness were all part of the same movement. Or, if the word movement has too many organizational implications, they shared a rage against empire. And when the time came for unified action, they would rise against Rome. The people of Qumran and the early Christians could not avoid the inevitable political reality. In the War Scroll, the importance of the political action is made explicit. After a detailed description of the timetable, equipment, weapons, and tactics to be used by the Sons of Light in their final, cataclysmic battle against the forces of darkness, and officers of the Sons of Light are instructed to encourage the troops with a series of prayers to God and martial exhortations, including the familiar oracle. Here is the quote. Our strength and power of our hands accomplish so mighty deeds except by thy power. No mighty deeds except by thy power, and by the might of thy great valor. This, though, has taught us from ancient times, saying, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. He shall smite the temples of Moab, and destroy all the children of Seth. He shall rule out of Jacob, and shall cause the survivors of the city to perish. The enemy shall be his possession, and Israel shall accomplish mighty deeds. End of quote. In later times, Christians would abandon the law of Moses, turning to faith in an incarnated Messiah's atonement for the sins of all mankind. But for the people of Judea in the first century, as seen in the scrolls and in the second-hand reports of Josephus Flavius, such a concept would have seemed alien and blasphemous. At a time of political and economic subjugation by an empire led by a deified Caesar, the destiny of Israel was rather to remain true to the traditions of family, farm, and temple, and to make the sons of darkness, both Roman and Judean, die for their sins. The redemption and renewal of Israel would not come through abandonment of the covenant, but through the strict observance of all its laws. The temple, not the tomb, was be the focus of liberation. And as time went on, the many of the long unpublished Qumran texts were released and made available to scholars. Evidence mounted that the original faith of Jesus and his followers in the imminent arrival of political and spiritual liberation may have been, in many respects, uncannily close to the angry, righteous gospel of the Dead Sea Scrolls.